Content note. The romance of a rogue contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and the romanticization of stalking. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 11. Bruce was brewing the usual midnight pot of tea when Christopher got back to his room, but he asked no questions, and the elder man was not sure if it would be policy to introduce the subject of Charmian. But just as they were going to bed, Bruce said suddenly, "I've fixed up finally about Jermyn Street and paid a month's rent in advance, so I can move in at any time now." "That is a step in the right direction," Christopher said with genuine pleasure. "And when do you think of taking possession?" "I thought tomorrow, if that will suit you." "My dear sir, any time will suit me," Bruce answered with some emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for all you've done for me. It's not possible to thank you, or ever repay 1/10 of your kindness, but I hope that you remember as long as I live, anything you want, anything I can do. I shall be only too pleased, too delighted, anything, no matter what it is." Christopher's sallow face flushed with pleasure. He held out his hand. "I'm proud to have been of service to you," he said. "Very proud." And he lay awake half the night thinking of Charmian and wondering in what way he could help her. It was at breakfast time the following morning that he said casually, "Your friend Mr. Smithers, has he a daughter?" Bruce looked up in surprise. "Yes. How did you know? She's only a girl, almost a child." "Ah." There was a certain subtlety in ejaculation, and Bruce said again, with a sharper note, "How did you know?" "Miss Lee told me that she saw you in the park on Sunday with a lady, and the rest I conjectured." Bruce flushed hotly. "She saw me? Charmian?" Christopher nodded. "And I imagine that is the reason she failed to keep her appointment with you," he said. There was a silence, which Bruce broke angrily. "It was a casual meeting. What nonsense! Anyone would think I had planned it beforehand." Christopher bent to stroke Beauty. "To a jealous woman it might perhaps appear as if it had been planned," he said. "Jealous? She!" Bruce laughed scornfully. "What nonsense! The day is gone long enough ago when it mattered to Charmian what I did." "The day is not gone. It is never gone," Christopher insisted quietly. He did not raise his eyes, and his long, thin fingers continued to caress Beauty's ears. He was not quite sure of his ground with Bruce Lowry on this subject, but the memory of the hard unhappiness in Charmian's eyes urged him on. "I know I am interfering in what is not my own business," he said very earnestly, "but it seems to me that the occasion warrants my interference. You have both been through deep waters, and if a few words from me can save either of you from further unhappiness, I am willing to risk your disapproval." And he told Bruce of his disconnected conversation with Charmian, and of the swift look of jealousy which he had surprised in her eyes. And yet, while he was speaking, he was conscious of a great doubt in his mind as to whether he was doing the right thing by trying to bring these two together again. If the fire that had once burned between them was cold, of what avail would it be to blow on the gray ash? Although he was confident that Bruce would climb back to his place in the world from which he had fallen, of Charmian he was less sure. He had never known her as anything but a worn, tired woman, and it seemed impossible to him that anything short of a miracle could cause youth and happiness to blossom again in her face. If Bruce Lowry was merely for the moment blinded by memories of the past, and the mist of his own remorse, what would happen in the future when that mist had cleared away? And then Bruce said in a queer, choked voice, "Is this the truth? Or are you saying it because you believe it's what I want to hear?" Christopher drew up his thin figure with a gesture of pride, and Bruce rushed on quickly. No, I beg your pardon. I did not mean that. I beg your pardon." And then, for some time, they were both silent, till Bruce said, "I shall move into Jermyn Street this afternoon." A shadow of pain crossed Christopher's face. "I shall miss you," he said, and Bruce answered, "I shall miss you too, and Beauty, but we shall meet every day. Wherever I am, there will always be a home and a welcome for you both." He went away in the afternoon without a handshake or a goodbye. "Because it's not goodbye," he he said cheerily, looking back up the dark, narrow staircase to where Christopher stood at the top with Beauty beside him. "You will both come and have supper with me after the show tomorrow night." Christopher shook his head. "You are very kind, but—" Bruce interrupted obstinately. "Nonsense! You will come. I shall call at the hall to fetch you." He felt light-hearted as a schoolboy as he walked to the top of the Edgware Road and took an omnibus to Piccadilly. He had already begun to put his house in order by arranging his affairs definitely with Mr. Smithers, and he had bought some new clothes and ordered them to be sent to the flat in Jermyn Street. There was a fire in the sitting room when he got there, and some daffodils in a vase on the table. "The last gentleman always liked a few flowers about the place," the housekeeper explained. "I do think they brighten things up. Would you like some tea, sir?" "Please," Bruce spoke absently. As he heard the door shut behind her, he felt that this was his first day of real freedom, as if only at this moment had he thrown aside his prison garb and the taint of the years that had gone. He looked into his bedroom. The new clothes were there in neat boxes, and he unpacked them and looked at them with boyish delight, hanging them carefully away in the wardrobe before he went back to the sitting room and sat down by the fire. So Charmian was jealous. Jealous of the child, Stella, with whom she had seen him on Sunday afternoon. Well, tomorrow should see the end of it all. Tomorrow he would tear down the wall which pride and pain had built between them. He would tear down every brick with his own hands and make her forgive him. Something warned him to leave her alone tonight, to allow another 24 hours of doubt to help him in the fight that was to come. He finished his tea and sat dozing and dreaming by the fire for the rest of the evening, his thoughts all of the future, and never of the past which seemed to be falling so far behind him. Even the memory of Christopher and Beauty had faded a little, had receded into the background like figures which one passes on a misty autumn evening. Charmian's alone stood out clearly and unimpaired, the Charmian of his youth, as she would be again in the happy future. In imagination, he could picture her here in the room with him, no longer tired and heavy-eyed, but bright and smiling, as God had meant her to be, starting life afresh with him by her side to help her. And then suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a sharp tat-tat on the outer door, and he started up drowsily, for a moment hardly realizing where he was, brushing his hand before his eyes before he went to answer the knock which had impatiently repeated. A man stood on the stone staircase, his back to the door, but he turned at the click of the latch. And it was Edward Lowry! For some seconds neither man spoke. Then Bruce made a half movement to shut the door again, but his brother was too quick for him. "I have not come to stay," he said. "I only want a word with you. Let me in." And he stepped past him into the narrow hall. Bruce was white with anger. "How did you know where to find me?" he demanded. "Smithers told me," his brother answered. He stood in the doorway of the sitting room, looking round him with critical eyes. "Aren't you going to be civil and ask me in?" he inquired. "Did you ask me in when we met outside your house?" Bruce answered. His brother looked him up and down before he answered. "Things were different then." "Different? In what way?" "I understand from Smithers that now you are in a position to keep yourself afloat, and that being so—" The elder man paused, and Bruce echoed his last words curtly. "Well, that being so, I mean that I am willing to overlook the past, on conditions." There was an eloquent silence. Then Bruce said very quietly, "You mean that now you are no longer afraid that I may attempt to borrow money from you. You have no objection to shaking hands with me. Is that it?" The elder man frowned. "I put things so bluntly. I came here with the friendliest of motives. I had a long talk to Smithers about you on Sunday night, and as a result I sent you a note to your rooms. Edgware Road, I understood you were staying. Did you get it?" "Yes." "Then why didn't you answer?" "Because I neither read it nor opened it." Edward Lowry flushed, and his eyes fell. "How long have you taken this place for?" he asked after a moment. "Indefinitely." "Indefinitely? My dear fellow, you don't seriously imagine that I am going to allow you to remain in London, do you?" Bruce came a step forward. "I don't understand," he said with ominous calm. His brother moved towards the table and laid down his hat and stick. "Now look here, listen to me and be reasonable," he said more affably. "I'm willing to overlook the past, as I said just now, if in return you are willing to help me." Bruce almost laughed. "I help you?" he mocked. "Yes." His brother sat down at the table. "Don't stand there like a policeman. Come and sit down, and let's have a friendly chat." Bruce stood immovable in the doorway. "What have you got to say?" he demanded. Edward shrugged his shoulders. "If you're determined to be so hostile, well, I can't help it," he began. His brother broke in rudely. "Oh, cut that! Say what you've got to say." "Very well." Edward rose. He was rather pale, and he kept drawing his gloves through his fingers with a little nervous gesture as he spoke. "It's this, then," he said tensely. "I'm going to be married to Rothbury's daughter." Bruce repeated the name unrecognizingly. "Rothbury's daughter, Rothbury." Then suddenly he broke into mirthless laughter. "Rothbury! My God! Rothbury, the judge who had sent him to a penal servitude. Rothbury, the hardest man who ever administered justice. And Edward was to marry his daughter." He saw the angry blood rising in his brother's face, and heard the suppressed passion in his voice when he spoke. "There's no need for you to sneer. It was my friendship for Rothbury that saved your neck 6 years ago. I did you a good turn then, whether you choose to admit it or not, and now you can do one for me." "How?" "By getting out of the country and staying out." Bruce's ironical laughter broke out afresh, and Edward went on with a sort of jaunty courage. "You must really look at the thing from my point of view, my dear fellow. Consider what it means to me. For the last 6 years I've done my best to live down the scandal you brought on the family. It is, thanks to my efforts, being gradually forgotten. In time it will be quite forgotten, if you are out of the way. But if it's known that you are here in London, people will never forget. They'll point me out as your brother. They'll point at my wife and recall all the sordid details of the trial." He stopped, but Bruce said nothing, and he went on again, believing his brother to be in a more amenable frame of mind. "Come now, you owe me some sort of reparation. Do the only possible and decent thing and go abroad. You can start again there, under another name if you prefer it. You can make a home for yourself. Get married." He waved his hand airily. "After all, there's nothing to keep you in England, and the only hope left for you is to make a completely fresh start in life. Well, what do you say?" "What are you laughing at?" Bruce came further into the room. "I am wondering what sort of a woman you imagine will marry a man whose own brother wishes to hound him out of the country because he is a criminal," he said grimly. Edward Lowry shrugged his shoulders and attentively examined a button on one of his gloves. "There are women, I have no doubt, who would regard you rather in the light of a hero," he said with irony. "Smithers was only telling me on Sunday night that his womenfolk seem to have taken a great fancy to you. Well, there is one instance. I don't think much of Smithers myself, but he's a man who has made money, and I believe he has an only daughter. You might do worse than consider it." The color had risen in ugly patches to Bruce Lowry's face. "You despise and shun me, and call me a murderer," he said thickly, "and yet you calmly suggest that I should marry a young and innocent girl for her money. Good God, man, what sort of moral code have you got?" Edward raised his eyes. "If it had only been on a level with yours, I should probably have spent the last 6 years in the same salubrious surroundings as yourself, my dear fellow," he said with studied insolence. "I think you rather forget that by your own action you have put yourself out of court." Bruce clenched his hands. His eyes were furious. He took a quick step forward, then, with a great effort, controlled himself, and, turning, flung the half-closed door wide. "Get out," he said thickly, and then again, "Get out!" Edward Lowry looked at him uneasily, hesitated, then took up his hat. "I came with the friendliest of intentions," he said for the second time. Bruce made no answer. He stood with averted head while his brother passed him, and hesitated at the front door. "I'll call tomorrow, or the next day, and see what you've decided to do," he said jauntily. Bruce spoke then, in a voice shaken with passion. "I can spare you the trouble by telling you that now." "Well?" Edward came back in eager step. "Well, what is it to be?" Bruce looked him full in the eyes. "I'm going to stay where I am," he said hoarsely. "Here, in this flat. Do you understand? And God help you if ever you come here again, or attempt to interfere with me. Now go!" And without another word, Edward Lowry went. Bruce bolted the door and sat down again by the fire. He was shaking with passionate anger and a sense of outrage. His breath came fast, and for some time he sat with closed eyes and hands so tightly clenched that the knuckles stood out white beneath the skin. To be hounded out of England like a common criminal, and by his own brother! Was that Edward's idea of justice, after all that he had suffered, merely to get rid of him, to bury him in some far-off corner of the world? Apart from his great bitterness of soul, there was a sense of infinite hurt that life had not yet ceased to rain her blows upon him, and with every day now, his capacity for suffering seemed greater, his cultivated stoic acceptance of fate less impregnable. And he thought of Hardingham, the man who had brought him to this. The already long score against him seemed to be mounting up with every passing day. Where was he, and would they ever meet again? Would life grant him this one satisfaction, to stand him face to face with the man who had been his ruin, and allow him to take his revenge? And then swiftly he tried to crush the thought. For Charmian's sake he would put the desire behind him, must follow the doctrine of the little meek, well-intentioned Chapelain, and love his enemies. And a thought, which was in reality an unformed prayer, rose in Bruce Lowry's heart, that if Charmian would forgive him and love him again, he would wipe out the score against Hardingham, against all the world. And that is the end of Chapter 11 of The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day!